Imagine for a moment that the history of the Cold War you were taught was only half of the story. We are often told of a world neatly sliced in two, a bipolar reality where the democratic West stood in a permanent, frozen standoff against a monolithic communist East. In this narrative, the Soviet Union is an unbreakable block of steel where every nation from Berlin to Vladivostok moved in perfect rhythmic synchronization with the heartbeat of the Kremlin. But in 1948, a crack appeared in that steel, not caused by an American diplomat or a British spy, but by the one man Joseph Stalin trusted to be his most loyal disciple in the Balkans. This was the beginning of a secret civil war that the world was never supposed to see, a clash of titans that pitted the most feared man in history against a charismatic guerrilla leader who refused to become a puppet. This is the story of the 1948 break between Josip Broz Tito and Joseph Stalin, a moment of high-stakes geopolitical gambling where the prize was the sovereignty of a nation and the cost of failure was certain death. To understand how the most powerful alliance in the Eastern Bloc turned into a lethal rivalry, we have to look at the man who stood at the center of the storm. Josip Broz Tito was not like the other leaders of Eastern Europe.
While the heads of Poland, Hungary, and Romania had largely been installed by the advancing Red Army, Tito had a different pedigree. He was a war hero in his own right. During the darkest days of the Second World War, his partisan forces had waged a brutal and incredibly effective campaign against the Nazi occupation. While other nations waited for liberation from the outside, Tito's forces had done much of the heavy lifting themselves, liberating vast swaths of Yugoslavia and building a grassroots revolutionary movement that owed as much to its own blood and sacrifice as it did to Soviet support. This gave Tito something that no other leader in the Soviet sphere possessed: a domestic power base and a sense of independent legitimacy. To the people of Yugoslavia, Tito was the man who had defeated Hitler. To Stalin, however, Tito was supposed to be just another loyal lieutenant in the global march of Bolshevism. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the bond between Moscow and Belgrade seemed unbreakable. Tito was the golden child of the communist world. He modeled his secret police after the NKVD. He collectivized agriculture with a fervor that impressed even the hardliners in the Kremlin, and his rhetoric was more aggressively anti-Western than Stalin's own. In fact, Tito's Yugoslavia was often more Catholic than the Pope, so to speak, pushing for a radical revolutionary agenda that sometimes moved faster than Moscow was prepared for. But beneath this surface of ideological harmony, the seeds of a deep and bitter friction were already being sown. Stalin, a man defined by a pathological need for total control, viewed the world through the lens of Soviet security. For him, the Eastern European states were not partners, they were a buffer zone, a series of satellite states whose only purpose was to protect the Russian heartland and obey the dictates of the Kremlin. Tito, however, had a different vision. He didn't just want to lead a satellite, he wanted to lead a regional power. He began dreaming of a Balkan Federation, a massive communist superpower that would include Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, and perhaps even Albania and Greece. To Stalin's ears, this sounded like a direct challenge to his monopoly on power. The Soviet leader watched with growing suspicion as Tito began conducting his own foreign policy, sending Yugoslav advisors to Albania and supporting the communist insurgents in the Greek Civil War without asking for Moscow's permission. Stalin realized that he didn't have a puppet in Belgrade, he had a rival. By early 1948, the atmosphere between the two capitals had turned from fraternal to icy. Stalin began to apply the same pressure tactics he had used to crush his internal rivals during the Great Purge. He withdrew Soviet military and civilian advisors from Yugoslavia, claiming they were being treated with hostility by the locals. It was a classic Soviet signal, a precursor to a total diplomatic excommunication. Tito, sensing the walls closing in, did something that no one in the Eastern Bloc had ever dared to do. He didn't apologize. He didn't fly to Moscow to beg for forgiveness on his knees. Instead, he wrote back to Stalin, defending Yugoslavia's right to manage its own internal affairs. The exchange of letters that followed is one of the most remarkable documents in the history of the 20th century. Stalin's tone was that of a disappointed father dealing with a rebellious child, filled with veiled threats and reminders of who held the real power. Tito's responses were firm, respectful in tone, but unyielding in substance. He reminded Stalin that the Yugoslav revolution was won by Yugoslavs, not by the grace of the Red Army alone. This was a heresy of the highest order. In Stalin's world, there was only one center of gravity, and it was located in the Kremlin. Any suggestion that a communist state could have its own path was a threat to the entire Soviet architecture. Stalin believed he could end this rebellion with a single gesture.
He famously remarked to his inner circle, "I will shake my little finger, and there will be no more Tito." He expected that once the Cominform, the international organization of communist parties, officially denounced Tito, the Yugoslav Communist Party would collapse from within. He believed that the pro-Soviet factions in Belgrade would rise up, arrest Tito, and replace him with someone more obedient to Moscow. But Stalin had underestimated the loyalty Tito had cultivated during the war. On June 28, 1948, the bombshell finally dropped. The Cominform issued a resolution accusing the Yugoslav leadership of hateful policies toward the Soviet Union and calling on healthy elements within the Yugoslav party to force their leaders to change course or replace them. It was a formal invitation for a coup d'état. Yugoslavia was officially expelled from the family of communist nations. Overnight, Tito and his inner circle became the most hunted men in the socialist world. They were branded as traitors, spies, and Trotskyite agents of Western imperialism. The borders were closed, trade was severed, and the Soviet propaganda machine began a character assassination campaign of unprecedented scale. Tito now found himself in a position of terrifying isolation. To his west were the capitalist powers of NATO, who viewed him as a dangerous communist revolutionary and a puppet of the East.
To his east was the Soviet Union, now mobilizing its propaganda and its military might to destroy him. For the first time in the history of the Cold War, a country stood entirely alone, caught between two massive hostile blocs. In the streets of Belgrade, there was a palpable sense of dread. The people knew that the Red Army was stationed just across the border in Hungary and Romania, and everyone knew what happened to those who crossed Joseph Stalin. The question on everyone's mind was not if Stalin would strike, but when. Tito had committed the ultimate sin of the 20th century. He had challenged the leader of the communist world and demanded the right to be independent. He had survived the Nazis, he had survived the partisan struggle, but he was now facing the most dangerous man on the planet in a game where there were no rules and no second chances. As the Soviet tanks began to move toward the borders and the first reports of sabotage within Yugoslavia started to surface, Tito realized that the real war was only just beginning. The golden child was now the forbidden revolutionary, and the world held its breath to see if a small Balkan nation could truly survive the wrath of a superpower.
But Stalin was about to find out that Tito had one more card to play, a move that would not only save Yugoslavia, but would fundamentally change the course of the Cold War and rewrite the rules of global geopolitics forever. The shadow of invasion was looming, the secret police were moving into the shadows of Belgrade, and the clock was ticking toward a confrontation that would decide the fate of millions. The shadow of the Red Army was no longer a distant memory of liberation. By the late months of 1948, it had become an existential threat loitering just beyond the Yugoslav borders. For Tito, the expulsion from the Cominform was the equivalent of a medieval excommunication, but with modern tanks and secret police. He was now the ultimate paradox of the Cold War, a committed communist who was officially an enemy of the Soviet Union,
and a revolutionary who was still deeply distrusted by the capitalist West. Stalin's strategy was multifaceted, designed to break Yugoslavia through a combination of economic strangulation, internal subversion, and psychological warfare. The Soviet Union and its satellites immediately imposed a total commercial blockade. Yugoslavia, which conducted over 70% of its trade with the Eastern Bloc, suddenly found its factories without raw materials and its people facing the prospect of systemic starvation.
This was the moment Stalin expected the Yugoslav people to turn on their leader. He believed that under the weight of poverty and the fear of Soviet wrath, the Yugoslav Communist Party would splinter, leading to a pro-Moscow coup. But Stalin had fundamentally miscalculated the nature of Tito's regime. Unlike the leaders of other satellite states who had spent the war years in Moscow hotels, Tito's commanders had spent the war in the mountains. They were accustomed to being surrounded, they were used to scarcity, and their loyalty was forged in the fire of partisan warfare. Tito's response to the threat of internal subversion was swift and ruthless. He knew that the Soviet secret police, the MGB, had spent years cultivating assets within the Yugoslav military and administration. To secure his survival, Tito launched his own internal purge. Thousands of suspected Stalinists or Cominformists were arrested and sent to the notorious prison island of Goli Otok. In a tragic irony of history, Tito used Stalinist methods to protect his right to be an anti-Stalinist. This internal cleansing ensured that when the Soviet pressure reached its peak, the Yugoslav state remained a disciplined, if terrified, monolith. As the internal front was secured, the external threat intensified.
Throughout 1949 and 1950, the Soviet Union conducted massive military maneuvers in Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, simulating a multi-pronged invasion of Yugoslavia. Border skirmishes became a daily occurrence, with thousands of recorded incidents of gunfire and incursions. Stalin was also engaged in a more personal campaign, assassination. The Soviet secret services launched multiple plots to eliminate Tito, ranging from poisoned jewelry to biological agents. It was during this period that Tito allegedly sent his most famous and defiant message to the Kremlin. The note, found in Stalin's personal desk after his death, read, "Stop sending people to kill me. We've already captured 5 of them, one of them with a bomb and another with a rifle. If you don't stop sending killers, I'll send one to Moscow and I won't have to send a second." This was not just bravado, it was a signal that the master of the Kremlin was dealing with a man who understood the language of violence as well as he did. However, defiance alone could not feed a nation or arm a military against Soviet divisions. Tito was forced to make a geopolitical move that shocked the world. He reached out to the very imperialists he had spent years denouncing. In Washington, the Truman administration saw an opportunity that was too good to pass up.
While they had no illusions about Tito's communist credentials, they realized that a successful Yugoslav resistance would shatter the myth of Soviet unity and tie down dozens of Red Army divisions that would otherwise be facing NATO in Germany. Under the policy of keeping Tito afloat, the United States began sending massive amounts of food aid, economic loans, and eventually advanced military equipment. By 1951, Yugoslav pilots were being trained to fly American jet fighters. This was the ultimate irony: a communist army prepared to defend its socialist revolution with capitalist weapons. This third way gave birth to a unique form of governance known as Titoism, which combined a one-party state with a more decentralized economy and an open-door policy toward the West. The turning point in this secret war came in March 1953, not through a battle or a treaty, but through a stroke. The death of Joseph Stalin changed everything. Without the personal vendetta of the man of steel driving the conflict, the new Soviet leadership under Nikita Khrushchev realized that the attempt to crush Yugoslavia had been a strategic failure. It had pushed Tito into the arms of the West and created a permanent fracture in the global communist movement.
In 1955, in one of the most stunning reversals of the Cold War, Khrushchev traveled to Belgrade to personally apologize to Tito, blaming the entire conflict on the excesses of Stalin's secret police chief, Lavrenti Beria. Khrushchev's visit was a total diplomatic victory for Tito. He had stood his ground against a superpower, survived the most dangerous man on earth, and forced the Soviet Union to accept the principle that there were many roads to socialism. That Tito was too savvy to simply jump back into the Soviet embrace. He knew that his survival depended on never being fully dependent on either side again. This realization led to the final and perhaps most significant legacy of the 1948 break, the creation of the non-aligned movement. Along with leaders like Nehru of India and Nasser of Egypt, Tito positioned Yugoslavia as the leader of a third group of nations, countries that refused to be pawns in the Cold War struggle between Washington and Moscow. For the next 3 decades, Yugoslavia enjoyed a level of international prestige and influence that far outweighed its size or economic power. It became the bridge between worlds, a place where Eastern diplomats and Western businessmen could meet, and a symbol of independence in an era of empires. The secret war that Stalin couldn't win ended not with a bang, but with a fundamental shift in the rules of geopolitics.
Tito's defiance proved that the Soviet monolith was a facade, and that even within the shadow of a superpower, a small nation with a determined leadership and a unified domestic front could carve out its own destiny. However, this independence came at a cost. The Titoist system relied heavily on the personal charisma and iron fist of Tito himself. He had built a nation held together by his own willpower and the unique circumstances of the Cold War. When he passed away in 1980, the delicate balance he had maintained between East and West and between the various ethnic groups of Yugoslavia began to unravel. But for one extraordinary moment in the 20th century, a guerrilla fighter from the Balkans had looked the most powerful man in the world in the eye and refused to blink. In doing so, he didn't just save his country, he showed the world that history is not just made by superpowers, but by those who have the courage to say no when the world expects them to obey. The 1948 break remains a masterclass in political survival, and a reminder that in the high-stakes game of geopolitics, the greatest weapon is often the refusal to be a puppet.